Thank you so much, Diego, for that introduction. I'm very excited to speak with everyone today. And these are kind of provisional insights, so I hope that we have a very interesting conversation afterwards. So I'll begin. On January 7th, members of the Eritrean NGO I volunteered with organized a Coptic Orthodox Christmas for recent Eritrean refugees in Centro Mattei, a secondary refugee reception center in Italy's SPRAR system, its refugee reception system. We had reserved a large aula in Centro Zonarelli, the intercultural center just outside of the city center. Each one of us had given 10 euros to help pay for the food, decorations, and utensils for the event. I arrived early to help with the setup. My first job was to make sure to collect the 10 euro donation from everyone there whom I judged would be able to do so. Ahmed believed that fewer people would shirk their responsibility in the face of someone who was a guest, that if he had taken on this task, friends would shrug their shoulders and say next time, and next time would pass without mention. Ahmed gave me the conspiratorial nudge as he sent me on my way, the smiling debt collector that I was. Members of the Eritrean community were invited to eat, dance, and drink with the young men, well, not alcohol, who were temporarily housed in the center. Even though these young men were effectively passing through the city, either located to secondary shelters across Italy or when having grown frustrated with the refugee reception system in Italy, gone on clandestine journeys to Northern Europe, these gatherings were meant to instantiate a sense of community while giving new refugees a sense that they were included in this transnational exile community. This informal welcoming work on the part of the NGO augmented and surpassed the welcoming work of the state and was meant to instantiate a sense of community out of the ephemeral socio-political and embodied realities of transit migration. This afternoon was no different from other events I attended with my friends and colloquiators. Similar events transpired anytime there was a major Christian holiday, and with it we would have two celebrations, one to mark the Roman Catholic date and one to mark the Coptic Orthodox one. During these events, mostly young men from the center would be invited to eat, dance, and celebrate with their co-nationals. Often we would distribute clothing and other necessities that had been donated by the wider community to these recent arrivals. On this particular occasion, after the festivities had come to a close, and as I set out to distribute the items that had been donated, mostly women and children's clothing, to a group of young men, some of the young men grew increasingly frustrated, holding up the women's clothing, items like fuchsia-colored sweaters and capri cargo pants to their frames, and tossing these items aside. Iwa, one of the men exclaimed, "What will this do for us?" I too was surprised by the number of women's and children's clothing and how at odds it was with empirical reality. As I surveyed their room, there was not one woman nor child. But as is often the case, the image of need, of deserving others, was obviously gendered. It was women who gave, women who cared, and racialized women who were in need of care and became the objects of that care. Yet that evening and countless other evenings contravened these easy assumptions and stereotypes. In 2015, nearly 70% of asylum claims lodged in the EU by Eritrean asylum seekers came from Eritrean men. These skewed gender dynamics, however, were not unique to Eritreans. With the de facto attenuation of family reunification laws in the EU, many young men erroneously believed that their partners could join them at a later date, if they had partners to begin with. Nevertheless, family fragmentation and the accompanying lack of romantic or sexual intimacy characterized many of these young men's lives well before their migratory journeys, one of the many detrimental consequences of mass militarization in Eritrea. So in this paper, I argue that Eritrean men construct alternate forms of community through the course of their migratory journeys. So in particular, I focus on the role of settled Eritreans in directing the conduct of recent arrivals through the care practices I highlight above. Here I refer to direction in the Foucauldian sense as an open-ended practice, one which is not invested in the coercive force of the law, but that which structures a potentially liberatory politics. Direction is most importantly consensual in nature and characterized by an incomplete reciprocity. By caring for recent for refugees, more or less settled Eritreans construct alternate forms of political community, hoping to instantiate shared values of mutual care, interdependence, and social solidarity out of the ephemeral embodied social and political realities of transit migration. So care here is conceptualized using both the paradigms of the Aristotelian Foucauldian ethics of care of the self, or simply as ethical self-fashioning that predominates in anthropology, and the feminist ethics of care, which understands care as a multi-scalar relational practice that collapses Western binaries around emotion and reason. Feminist ethics of care grounds care as a practice constitutive of human sociality, and in turn, any kind of form of political justice. So first, to illustrate the daily practices of care that constitute political community, I will examine daily embodied practices, visiting hospitalized refugees, clothing donation drives, and holiday celebrations, which were highlighted above, that work to instantiate a set of relational practices out of the uncertain migratory trajectories that characterize many refugees' lives. Practices that counter regimes of racialized abandonment and social anomie that arise in these realities. Second, I will look at the work of tesfa, or hope, that those who care for refugees summon as both an embodied and material practice, one that shapes ethical fashioning, self-fashioning for givers of care, and directs the receivers of care into moral ways of being Eritrean. So this comes out of a context in which refugees are stuckenness. So stuckenness here does not only refer to restrictions on physical mobility. The legal mechanisms that manage mobility also deeply circumscribe life paths and chances. For many of the young men I worked with, long-term family separation, suspended ambitions, under an unemployment and difficulty in finding romantic partners meant that their lives in Italy were lived in a suspended present, as many of them emphasized to me. Nevertheless, these men's lives revolved around the friendships that they had with one another. Friendship sustained these communities when other forms of affinity, relationality, and sociality were close to men. And friendship took on a deeply political valence as it followed already existing political divisions within the community. So, overwhelmingly homosocial in its nature, caring for one another, providing friendship, meeting and material and emotional needs is part of a concerted project to fashion alternate ways of being Eritrean, as my interlocutors emphasized. Reflecting on their own migratory journeys, the emotions of fear and uncertainty that characterize the Mediterranean crossing, and their early days in Italy, my interlocutors would make reference to the simple act of care and instruction as particularly emotionally potent examples of friendship and ethical relationality. As Gurmai, one of my interlocutors and my first entry into the community, described his first days in Italy, while we walked through the neighborhood, having Estefanos buy him a pair of pants stood out as one of his first memories of Estefanos' decency and humanity. These ordinary acts fashion new social bonds and forms of relationality that are situated in what both Michael Lambeck and Vina Das situate in the everyday, but everyday conditions of social and political crisis as the ones I underscore above. So this paper is based on 20 months of fieldwork conducted in Emilia-Romagna between 2015 to 2018. I conducted participant observation with an Eritrean communications and human rights NGO composed of mostly young men who constituted what Tricia Rediker-Hepner refers as Generation Asylum. So Generation Asylum refers to Eritreans who have emigrated as a result of the de facto state of exception that characterizes the country since 2001 and the concurrent global securitization and militarization of asylum regimes that followed September 11th. As critics of the Eritrean government, their official activities focused on crafting official statements and communiques regarding critical events that impacted Eritrean refugees at the EU-wide and national levels, and events that were happening within Eritrea proper. The other more unofficial labor that the group engaged in was around helping recent arrivals integrate into Italian society. This welcoming work, much like the discourse around accoglienza, or refugee reception, was meant to augment formal reception services that many of the members of the NGO worked in as cultural mediators as well. So early in my fieldwork, at the height of the crisis in 2015, I interviewed an Eritrean man in his mid-30s who aided refugees in transit. Our lives converged in strange ways, which is the nature of diasporas, something that I cannot recount here to avoid revealing his identity. But when we first met, he was jobless, spending his days in local bars debating with other Eritreans about the future of the country. Riven by the political conflicts that shaped the community, H imagined that aiding recent arrivals would break the ideological and psychological the regime in Eritrea exercised over its exile communities. Nevertheless, he understood that he was doing something against the law. Under EU Law 1.1a, aiding and abetting the entry or transit of unauthorized migrants is a criminal offense. So his words translated from Tigrinya below. So, quote, the difficulty of dissent, even for recent arrival, lies in the fact that if you go and criticize the government during a festival, people are afraid that they will be videotaped and then will lose relationships back in Eritrea. Even those who had left Eritrea would become upset with me for my activism because their parents would be arrested. Their family members didn't have light. The reason that I can do this activism is that my whole family lives outside of Eritrea. I have 5 siblings and they all live outside of Eritrea. None of them, though, can return to Eritrea. The stakes for activism in Italy is high because of the context of how difficult it is to survive as an immigrant in Italy. Also, the community doesn't help recent arrivals, and the Eritrean embassy encourages others not to help recent arrivals. People are secretly helping recent arrivals. But for me, I hope to help new people leave Italy because I don't want them to live the life that I have here, without papers and without work. I've been imprisoned by law, and if another Eritrean meets that fate, I want to help them escape it. So I continue on with H's words. So my goal is that they have somewhere to sleep, a life to live in a place like Sweden or Switzerland, a job, and then they can build an opposition movement. The reason I do this is to underscore the fact that people no longer help one another in Eritrea. And if we can rebuild trust and mutual assistance, then I think to myself that an Eritrean who goes to wherever country will begin to help others as well. Many Eritreans and other refugees, Italy, as we can see, is conceived as a point of transit in longer journeys towards a place that Eritreans imagine they can make refuge in. But his words above underscore not only a desire to help recent refugees make refuge that have not yet been found, but to create alternate forms of being and belonging. For H, care, haggaz, or aid is teleological in its nature. It is meant inasmuch to instantiate a democratic Eritrea, as it is to inculcate or direct the receivers of aid to be givers as well once they had found refuge. For H, this aid was meant to counter the sense of radical individuation or atomization that came with the experience of migrating to Europe, in which, to quote him again, one buried one's suffering. Haggaz or aid was unlike relations of control or coercion, in that their aims and objectives remained open to the possibility of building new relationships and potentially more political forms of social action. H later found a position as a cultural mediator. He often asked me to help recent arrivals from the center. Care was as simple as taking recent arrivals to the local TIM to buy a SIM card so that they could call family members to let them know that they had arrived safely. At another time, H asked me to visit a young woman who was in the hospital. Before I could, though, she had been discharged and transferred. It was unclear as to where. Yet H was not alone in hoping to instill hope, mutual care, and interdependence as values central to imagining alternate forms of being Eritrean. Tesfa, or hope in oneself, one's capacities to struggle, has animated Eritreans' political mobilizations around mobility and refuge. Activists saw their own aid for refugees in transit as a political praxis that instilled hope in those who gave and received aid. Hope was both an affect and an embodied exercise that centered around giving and receiving care and networks of mutual aid in the context of structural abandonment that characterizes young Eritrean lives. was also, quite critically, linked to the imagination of futures possible. For example, another of my interlocutors, D, often referred to young refugees as a lost generation, not generalization. Considerably older than H, D took on a fatherly role. His wife expressed her frustrations to me at the International Women's Day demonstration that her husband had taken on the role of a saint, shouldering the burden of responsibilities for, quote, these orphaned children, as he would refer to recent arrivals. She looked at me with a sideways glance. Each time I would meet with D, who would normally maintain a preternatural calm, he would instead bristle with his barely contained rage. Anytime he would describe the injustices against Minisayat, or the youth, and their own inability to, as he said to me, think for themselves, as expressed in the phrase "Hulum hangolom tatsibom," or that they've all had their minds brainwashed. And this is to refer to kind of the political indoctrination of life under a military regime. As Dee had said to me in one of our first conversation, we organize. So I won't read the Tigrinya out loud to you so that you don't have to suffer through my butchered accent. So we organize the children who had been kicked out. We give them hope, and that's what's important. We help them a little on their road or journey. We are very few here. We have little capacity. We ourselves need help, and we are doing something that is outside of the law. The word tesfa roughly translates to hope in English, but through the course of conversations, Dee reiterated this word repeatedly. Tesfa, though, contains a sense of self-efficacy, self-belief, which would mean more appropriately hope within oneself, within one's capacities to accomplish something. In a polysemitic language like Tigrinya, tesfa also refers to God's plan. For D to refer to recent arrivals, some, but not all, of whom are unaccompanied minors, as children who have been forced out or abandoned, was to emphasize that recent refugees were in need of care, and that the act of caring, even if it came from putative strangers, was the first step in constituting community. So care was conceived as a political act that contests policies of structural abandonment. For Eritreans whose lives are characterized by social fragmentation, racialized abandonment and surveillance, friendship and caring for one another were absolutely central to imagining what a democratic Eritrea could be, in the words of my interlocutors. And so I will end there. I hope that we have far more questions. There is a lot that is kind of unstated in this talk that we can discuss further. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Fiori. That was an incredibly ethnographically rich paper. But I actually find the idea of care as containing the potential for liberatory politics absolutely fascinating. And I really appreciate it also because I'm slightly suspicious about the uses and perhaps the abuses of Foucauldian ethics, especially when we get to describe this intense relationality that you have in ethics of giving, receiving, and reciprocating. Anyway, there will be time for questions at the end. So now is the turn for Angelica. Angelica, please.
Yes. Thank you so much, Fiori, for this wonderful paper, so rich in data, as Diego just mentioned. I would have loved to hear more. Just 1 second. Okay. So I wrote down some of the points that really caught my attention the most, and that maybe we can discuss later on. But I was really, having studied, being gender studies, also a big component of my background, I was really fascinated by this sort of reconfiguration of a traditional masculinity that you were somehow illustrating, at least to me. So how the idea of friendship and caring, in a way, is also reshaping a bit in a very interesting way, a configuration of masculinity that somehow and that sometimes can be very, very rigid and very patriarchal, where men do not perform certain practices. And so it was really fascinating to see here how friendship and caring become really essential aspect of the everyday life in Italy. Also, what I was thinking a bit when you were quoting your respondent made me think about some stories that I collected in my own research, and there was this idea. I think there is this idea of Italy in Eritrea specifically, right? And I believe is a sort of colonial legacy. So this idea that Italy was, and maybe still is, a kind of promised land, because there was so much history in connection between Italy and Eritrea. I noticed in Eritrea, some people still have strong ties with Italy. And this was a shock, especially for the people who from Eritrea migrated to Italy in the 1970s. This was one of the shock they experienced, because in Italy, on the other hand, there was no ties at all. So some of my respondents were telling me, we had this cultural capital about Italy, especially the Italian Eritrean people who were studying in Italian and going to Italian school. They were saying, in Eritrea, I was studying Dante, Divina Commedia. I had dreamed about Florence. And then when they arrived in Italy in the 1970s with an Italian passport in their hand, well, nobody knew about them. People don't even know where Eritrea is. And people ask them, but why do you speak Italian? So I think this is still a connection, and maybe we can talk about this later, that I think is still alive, but it's very one-sided. And then the ethics of caring, and you mentioned the feminist methods, how they helped you here. And I have to say, this was also incredibly important for me. The Black feminist epistemology and the ethics of caring was really eye-opening for me in my own research. It really helped me to see things that otherwise probably I wouldn't see, I think. So I'm really glad that you were talking about the ethics of caring and how this, in a way, should be implemented more in research methods, because they're really, really helpful. And then, yes, again, care was a big part of what we heard. And I thought this idea that you mentioned, care and caring as a political act in a context of social fragmentation. How important is this idea, and how interesting would be to develop it more? So for now I stop here, but I really hope later on we will have more time to discuss. And so I will go to my own paper now. So there were many things I wanted to share actually today, but then I decided to talk probably about my most recent work that is about Italy, about race, and about the colonial legacy in 2020 Italy. So in a country where we don't talk about race, in a country where citizenship is still transmitted by blood. And so I did this research with my colleague Guido Tintori, and we were asked actually by a group of researchers in the UK actually to talk about race and how race is classified in Italy. And so our response was to go back to the colonial time and to see how to show the implication that race and blood come from the fascist, but even the liberal period, and the implication they have in today's Italy. So, as you know, Germany just removed the word race from the constitution very, very recently. And also France decided to vote in 2018 to remove race from the constitution and to replace it with gender. So the word gender replaced race with the new article saying that all citizens are equal regardless of gender, origin, and religion. So they literally removed the word race. So what is the reason for that? The underlying rationale behind this act is that since there is only one race, the human race, any mention of the word in the public sphere would leave space for hierarchized interpretation of the concept of identity. And so the French policymaker decided to remove this word. So in continental Europe, so here is important for me to make it to distinguish the UK with continental Europe, because in many cases, continental European countries added the term race to their post-World War II constitution as a safeguard against racist idea and acts. And with the consolidation of peace and the rule of law across the continent intertwined with the process of European integration, these same European countries started both believing that it was now safe to eliminate race from politics and public policy, and also wondering whether a colorblind approach would be better suited to prevent future racial tensions. And in this respect, David Theo Goldberg suggests the reasons why race do no longer exist in Europe through a very interesting idea that he called racial Europeanization. And so according to Goldberg, race denial in Europe is wishful but unattainable, a frustrating desire buried and at the same time alive. So as he writes, race in Europe has left odorless traces, but one suffocating in the wake of their resinous stench. And so in this vein, race has become a taboo term across continental Europe. The word race is usually considered, is not acceptable because it instantly connects to biological implication and its connection with the guilt, the European guilt of the Holocaust. So European countries don't talk about race and do not collect ethnic data. So data based on the race, so-called race or ethnicity of their citizens. And so, as we know, race scientifically doesn't exist. There's not a gene that makes us belong to a race, but race as a social construct inevitably continues to impact the lives of racialized people. And in this sense, the absence of such targeted data creates a difficult conundrum, because on the one hand, it ensures that the states classify and count people in a perceived universalistic manner, but on the other side, it deprives policymakers and researchers of a tool to diagnose and to address the implication of racism. So in all of this, the case of Italy, according to me and Guido, is of particular interest due to the apparent erasure of race and consequently mixed race category from both institutional and public discourses. In fact, in Italy, governments at all levels and bureaucratic agencies cannot discriminate against people on the basis of race, sex, and religion, as affirmed in the 3rd article of the Constitution. By the same token, even when Italian policymakers realize that race and ethnicity matter, this doesn't translate into specific anti-racist laws and policies. Anti-racist norms are incorporated into pieces of legislation addressing social hatred, violence, but not the identity of the person who has experienced the damage. So, owing to the interdependence of colonialism, ideas of race, and the construction of national identity, we try to investigate the reason why in Italy we don't talk about race. And what are the connections with our colonial past? Does blood really matter? And our answer, as you will see, is yes, it still does matter a lot. In fact, we argue that forms of racialization of citizenship are still operating today, and they can be traced back to the beginning of the 20th century, when the first citizenship law of the unified state was approved. And this overview provides an instrumental framework for the analysis, especially of the colonial part, where I will talk about race and mixed race and how these categories were really important in the construction of Italian identity. So a good starting point is probably 1861, when Italy unifies as a nation state. In 1861, the newly unified Italy was faced with the question of imagining the nation and defining citizenship. Let's remember that when Italy unifies in 1861, only 2.5% of the population speak Italian. So just to tell you, there is a famous phrase from a founding father, Massimo d'Azeglio, who says, now that we made Italy, we need to make Italians because they don't exist. So you can imagine how difficult it was to create this idea of a nation. And so in terms of citizenship, the Civil Code of 1865, the so-called Codice Pisanelli, the article 1 to 5 talks about the norms of acquisition, loss, and transmission of Italian citizenship. So we are in 1865. Let's say that the juridical work for the code came from Pasquale Stanislao Mancini. And Mancini had theorized that the coincidence of origin and blood was a constitutive element of a nation. So in Mancini's view, the nation resembled first and foremost to a family, and blood ties were the cornerstone upon which statehood was to be founded. Consistently, jus sanguinis, so right of blood, became the principal criterion regulating the transmission and the conservation of citizenship. This also because, let's imagine that between 1890 and 1916, out of 38 million of Italians living in Italy, just in this small period, 14 million left because of poverty. So talking about blood, there was literally a hemorrhage of people living. And so blood was seen as the only element able to keep together this diaspora. So it doesn't matter where were you born. If you have Italian blood that is being transmitted to you, you are Italian. So this was the principle. However, the static conception of citizenship regulated by this code, the Civil Code of 1865, was challenged soon by two events. On the one hand, as I mentioned, the emigration of Italian nationals in massive numbers, and on the other, the participation of the country in the colonial scramble for Africa. And both implied a mixing blood with different population. So, just to briefly talk about the law, let's say that the jurists and policymakers of the time considered pivotal to guarantee that every person who had Italian blood in their veins was also an Italian citizen. And the law strongly asserted jus sanguinis as the cardinal principle of Italian nationality, to the point that when Italian nationality was transmitted by blood, by a male citizen, even abroad, it was practically impossible to lose it, even after many generations. So even if still today, if you have a great, 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 great grandfather who migrated to Brazil in 1895, and if you're able to show evidence of his citizenship, you can apply for an Italian passport, for Italian citizenship. But I will explain you later how difficult this is for people born in Italy who do not have this infamous blood. And so even though the main rationale behind this legislation was to advocate and support the idea of a grassroots diasporic expansionism, the law didn't include any explicit mention to race. This doesn't mean that its underpinning ideology was immune from forms of racial hierarchization, especially the Orientalist kind. And so what about the colonies? What happened in East Africa, where Italians started the first colony? Eritrea was created in 1890, and already at the beginning of the 1900s, the governor in Eritrea have to talk about citizenship, because there are already a number of children born from Italian fathers going to Africa. And it's very interesting because jus sanguinis, so the right of blood, was working also in this case. So just to give you an idea, in 1905, more than 2,000 Italians lived in Eritrea, defined as the firstborn colony. Among the 482 women who initially settled in the colony, only 73 were married, while 80% of the European men living in the colony were aged over 16 and were either unmarried or went to Africa without their wives. So given such an unequal sex ratio, many Italian men had sexual relationship with Eritrean women, giving birth to the first generation of Black mixed-race Italian children, named, using the jargon of the time, meticci. Long-term residents in particular had relationships with local women within a practice known as madamato that was built on an existing form of temporary marriage in Eritrea and named the mos. According to this practice, an Eritrean woman could commit herself to temporarily live in a conjugal manner with a man for a payment of a certain amount of money. And in case of children being born, the man had to provide economic support for both the partner and the children. Although some Italian men respected some terms of this contractual form of marriage, many eventually left, abandoning both women and children, especially those whose presence in Africa was shorter. In 1931, the number of Italians in Eritrea from 2,000 had risen to 4,200, and a third of the children born in the colony were mixed. So we don't have numbers about the unrecognized children, but 1/3 of the children born and recognized were mixed. So they had an African mother and an Italian father. In 1938, the Italian population skyrocketed to 68,000 people from 4,200, mostly young single men. And this was due to the invasion of Ethiopia. And so 300,000 soldiers were sent to Eritrea in order to prepare and fight the war against Ethiopia. Here, the census conducted in 1938 showed the presence of 2,518 mixed-race children. And half of these, 1,291, were recognized by their fathers. And it's also calculated that from 1940 to 1946, between 5,000 and 7,000 mixed-race children were born in Eritrea, marking the 1940s as the highest period of interracial relationships. So from the beginning, and this is important because we always think that the racial laws come entirely from the fascist period, while in reality, the fascist period takes inspiration in a way from the previous period, the liberal period. And so in terms of citizenship and identity of these mixed-race children, so the status of mixed-race children was defined by the Codice Civile del Regno of 1865. So there was another code for the colonies, according to which the children recognized by their Italian father were fully fledged Italian, even when the mother was a colonial subject. The children recognized by their Italian father had the juridical right to be considered Italian and to benefit from Italian citizenship. So what is interesting here is the situation of a child born from unknown parents. So we don't know who the father is. And so here, the Article 8 of the code stated that in this case, a child born in the colonies could gain Italian citizenship only if their physical features showed the presence of Italian blood. So for the first time, I would say, we categorize Italianness using biological criteria, blood. So this was 1865. As I mentioned, this is still the criteria to transmit citizenship now in 2020. So this code from 1909 was never implemented, but it was used as a reference model for further legislation. And so we jump to 1933, fascist regime. What happens? In 1933, the Ordinamento Organico per l'Eritrea e la Somalia, another code, deals with citizenship. And we can see here the effects of racial purity theorizations occurring in Italy. So the Article 18 of this Ordinamento stated that mixed-race children born in the colonies and recognized by their father, they had the juridical right to be Italian. Again, in the case of unknown parents, Italian citizenship was granted only to mixed-race individuals who were able to show on their body phenotypic signs of, and I quote, clear racial intermixing with a member of the white race. So you needed to show sign that the white race had shaped your body. So this racial measurement was conducted physically through a series of craniometrical tests, including the morphological analysis of the skull and the measurement of the cranial capacity. The Declaration of the Empire of Africa Orientale Italiana, so Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, and the 9th of May 1936, Mussolini declared the birth of the empire, Impero dell'Africa Orientale Italiana, composed by Eritrea, Italian Somaliland, and Ethiopia. And so what happens here? That suddenly we need to reconsider citizenship, because now ideas of race have changed. Now Italians are Aryans. They belong to a pure race, to a superior race, and so we cannot accept anymore miscegenation. And so the racial laws start to target specifically these. The first racial decree, dating 1937, aimed at the prevention of interracial relationships. So the Italian citizen who was caught having a relationship of conjugal nature could go to jail from 1 to 5 years. So I don't have time to go into this now, but it's striking to see that, for example, if you were going to court and you were saying that in reality you were raping a woman, you were not asking for her consent, well, very often you were fine, so you were not considered guilty. Who was considered guilty was the man who actually treated the African partner as an equal. That was considered the worst crime. And so people actually go to jail because of that. And so the first racial law is actually applied in the colonies, not in Italy, and is 1937. Then, of course, in 1938, we have a publication of a text, a very important text called the Manifesto degli Scienziati Razzisti, or Race Manifesto, that disappeared on a newspaper in July 1938. It was a text made of 10 chapters, and in every chapter, we know more about race. We know that Italians belong to have a purity of blood that cannot be contaminated. The purely character of the Italians would be ruined by racial mixing with extra-European races, so we have to be careful. One of the articles invite Italians to proclaim themselves frankly racist. And so, jumping a bit, in 1940, what happens? In 1940, we have a further racial law against mixed-race children in the colonies, meaning that they cannot become Italian citizens anymore, even if the father recognized them. So the jus sanguinis doesn't work anymore for them. because it's similar to the one-drop rule. Because they have an African mother, they also have African blood, and this is incompatible with the Italian blood, and so they cannot get Italian citizenship anymore. Now, these laws will be repealed in 1947, 1952, although we have to say that the same kind of racist connotations, they don't disappear. In fact, research showed that, for example, Libyans, because they were lighter skinned, they were considered more similar to Italians, unlike Eritreans, Somali, or Ethiopians. And so Libyans got Italian citizenship much easier than, for example, people from East Africa. So now, Italy, post-colonial Italy, we define this country a country in denial, because if we think about all of this, we realize that having a law, the current citizenship law, the law 92 from 1991, is based on ius sanguinis. So as I was saying earlier, right of blood. And this is in contrast, for example, with other countries. If we think about the US, there is the ius soli. Obviously, there are also reasons, very clear reasons why we couldn't have a ius sanguinis in the US. But in very simple terms, what does it mean? It means that Italian citizenship from birth is inherited by blood and not by birthplace. So a children born in Italy to non-Italian parents is classified not as an Italian, but as a foreigner. So if you were born in Italy from people who don't have any connection with an Italian national and who are not Italian themselves, you are not Italian, you are a foreigner. And you don't have citizenship. So you have to wait until the age of 18 to ask for citizenship. Is not granted. So the dichotomization of identity becomes immediately apparent here, given that such a restrictive juridical device does not leave room for other forms of Italianness beyond that which is identified through the presence of blood lineage. Therefore, when the results of the census are released, it provides data on Italians and foreigners, no other categories. So within the Italian, we don't know who is Black Italian, Asian Italian. We have no idea. We just know that there are Italians and there are foreigners. But among the foreigners, there are people who were born and raised in Italy, but they don't have Italian blood. So I think I'm concluding soon. So what we notice that these juridical practices seem quite paradoxical when one considers that in Italy today, there are approximately 1 million children who were born on Italian soil to foreign parents. And yet, owing to their lack of the right blood, they are not granted citizenship at birth. They are instead deemed outside the nation on a number of levels. Because imagine they cannot vote, they cannot do certain jobs, for example, where Italian citizenship is compulsory. They cannot sit public examination to access certain government jobs. They are also, they experience constraints and limitation on practicing sport and the mobility. It's really difficult to leave Italy if you are not an Italian citizen and if you are not European. In the visa and Schengen, so this is really affecting the mobility. And so following the historical racial dynamics characterizing Italy that we tried to trace, one might wonder, so why it is relevant to talk about race in Italy today? The erasure of the state classification of race and ethnicity, supposedly based on principle of universalism, is problematic and detrimental for a number of reasons. Firstly, the erasure of race on the basis of equality among human beings, like in the case of France or Germany, ends up paradoxically reinforcing dynamics of inequality based precisely along racial lines and racialized view of identity. As a direct consequence, colorblindness in relation to racial statistics not only contributes to the perpetuation of white privilege, but also widens the color line divide and enhances systemic racism. The analysis of racial data tell us, in fact, that not all citizens are equal before the law, nor have the same opportunities despite sharing the same nationality. In the US, for example, we know that Black and darker skinned populations are 3 times more likely to be poor than the white population. They earn on average 40% less. They receive an inferior education, and they are target of racial profiling by the police. They are more frequently arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated. So this is because we investigate this kind of data. We collect this data, and rather than using race and ethnicity to monitor disadvantage and discrimination, European countries have adopted an approach in fighting racism that may be labeled anti-racist policies without race, meaning that anti-discrimination and anti-racist policies are addressed without using race. So we don't name the big, massive elephant in the room. So how can we do anti-racist work if we don't even name race? And so I can conclude here, I would say, and I hope, yes, sorry, I was going a bit fast. I had a lot to say, but I hope this was giving you a certain idea of race Italy and the connection with the colonial past that is actually very, very present today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angelica. It was brilliant. And, besides highlighting the paradox of anti-racism without race, I think that your talk also beautifully shows how the genealogy of Italian policies and political categories needs to be understood in a longue durée perspective. And I'm very happy that you mentioned, the unification of Italy as an integral part in this broader history that you trace. And of course, this is hugely important in the context of a country that understands its political history through tropes of discontinuity, especially with the fascist past. I mean, there is a lot to say about how Italian historiography construed the colonial time and what came after. But fair enough. We'll give Fiori 5 minutes to respond. Fiori, please.
Okay, Angelica, that was a really wonderful presentation. I thought it was a wonderful genealogy of colorblindness in Italy that disavows its racialist and masculinist origins within Italian unification, citizenship laws, and empire, as Diego had underscored above. What I found really interesting too, you work on the continuities between Italian colonialism and the present regarding race. And for me, in my own work and thinking about mobility on a kind of larger plane, when you describe how Libyans had preferential rights to Italian citizenship versus their Eritrean and Somali counterparts, to me, it has quite resonances with mobility regimes on the African continent in the present, with border externalization deals and this racialized violence to keep darker skinned Africans out, that that plays off of these embedded color based categories, right, and taxonomic categories. I thought it was a really wonderful, for what I found really interesting was also the concept of the anti-racist work without ever dealing with race. And so I would find it really interesting to think about in some ways what are the convergences between mechanisms of racialization and in the United States, are there divergences? One in the ways, we think about the origins of race in the US, of course, with chattel slavery and, the Atlantic, but thinking about it in terms of the Mediterranean world and, the Venetian slave trade or even of this work of complicity that I highlighted above, colonial complicities and militarism and violence would be a really interesting way to kind of think about the continuities between and discontinuities between past and present. And what's always kind of fascinating about race and racial categories is that they remain, they're highly mutable, but they remain quite durable over quite a long period of time, which you highlighted, I think, between the changes in terms of moving away from thinking about the character or the recognition, paternal recognition of mixed race subjects and looking for traces of whiteness to a racial ideology of hypodescent. So I think that was, I thought that was a fascinating and a wonderful presentation. And I think about also the struggles that children of the 1.5 generation face in moving away from a discourse of blood towards a vision of living together, of being Italian as being in place and having a right to make place, which is something that I emphasize in my own work. So thank you very much.
Grazie, thank you, Fiori. And also, you know, what you said in your paper, the generation asylum. Well, that's a generation that is growing now. People are born from this, and so again, they were born from this kind of colonial pattern, right? The exclusion, and still they are in a country where the history with Africa is not recognized, and still there is blood as a criteria to give citizenship. So, you know, people in Italy are very resistant when I mention this. I get a lot of criticism because people are really offended and say, how dare you to say that the citizenship law has racial connotation? What are you talking about? Well, this is what I'm talking about, but still it's very, very difficult because the colonial past is seen as past. Is gone, is finished, fascism doesn't exist, we are surrounded by fascist monuments completely decontextualized, but still fascism has no effect on us, right? And all of this history that is not taught has an impact. So, and also you mentioned the masculinist feature. That is very important because I didn't mention that until not a long time ago, where only men could transfer Italian citizenship.